it sure is nice to come home at the end of a long day and enjoy a podcast. But you know what makes the experience that much better? Relaxing with a few puffs of smoke from my McQueen pipe. At McQueenPipes.com, I was able to find the perfect smoking pipe to suit my nerdy, yet dignified sensibilities. I especially love that each pipe is designed and handcrafted by a true artisan, and that all of their pipes are inspired by fantasy books and movies like The Lord of the Rings. Being a bit of a hobbit myself, my pipe is called the Barrel Rider, but they've also got pipes for wizards, rangers, dragon riders, or even goblins. If pipe tobacco isn't your thing, no worries. McQueen Pipes has got you covered with attachments for vaping or even cannabis. Head on over to McQueenPipes.com and use the code BIOGRAPHERS at checkout to receive 15% off of your entire order. Go ahead, treat your nerdy heart to something you'll cherish and enjoy your podcast listening experience in style with a McQueen pipe. That's Mac like mac and cheese and Queen like the band. McQueenPipes.com and use the code BIOGRAPHERS at checkout for a 15% discount on your whole order. Cheers, everyone, and happy podcasting.
I do hope you can see me today from where you are.
Ich bin ein Feeling.
If I'm generally anything, I guess I'm generally miserable.
This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women.
The people, I would say, there is no patent. Would you patent the sun?
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
Welcome to the Biographers.
Maybe from a logical perspective, somebody could, outside of my purview, could say, you know what, Akiva, you got it home. The parts you could probably find somewhere. Just fix it. But after the insanity, after the odyssey that I have undergone to get this van home, just to recap for the listeners, Daniel did a very good job explaining this earlier. Drove out to Kansas, car broke down, called 9 mechanics, none of them showed up, so I had to pay a last-minute $250 flight on Frontier, no less, home so I could teach a class. We were supposed to go around this thunderstorm that was completely enclosing all of Kansas, but the pilot just didn't seem to be bothered. So we went through like a tornado-filled thunderstorm in which our plane got struck by lightning. The entire right wing of the plane just immediately turned white. You couldn't see anything out of the windows for a second. It sounded like somebody with a very large rubber mallet slammed into the side of the plane.
Jeez.
I was not sitting next to Shalana when this happened, by the way. Because
right.
We bought last-minute tickets. Luckily, I was sitting next to this guy who was an aerospace engineer, and he was just like coding on his laptop. Well, and I've been on, I had divorced parents who lived in separate coasts. I've been on an airplane a couple of times, at least 30, 40 times, right? This was the worst turbulence I have ever experienced, the worst flight I've ever been on. And the guy completely unfazed while all of this is happening. The plane drops like 20 feet out of the air. At least, you can never tell how much because you're in the plane. But it felt about like 20 feet, right? Like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then catch air. Like that much falling sensation, right? And he goes, I've never seen that happen before. And I'm like, what? What? And he's like, nah, man, these things are bomb proof. Like, unless it's user error, nothing's going to take this thing out of the sky. And he was just so confident. And I wish I could have been like, yeah, I agree, man. Totally. People are here. No, there was nothing. Every bump was like, I was having a dialogue with God as all of this was happening. And I was like, it's because I'm not praying enough. And the plane would like jump to the ground. I was like, no, it's not that. It's not that. It's I'm not giving enough to charity. And the plane would go smooth. It's like, okay, so I know that I need to give more charity. But is it because like I'm just like a little too mean to Shalane and the plane would drop and it's like, okay, I know I have to work on that. Like that's like the amount of like mental gymnastics I'm going through to do this. Get home, teach the class. Ended up driving back with my friend with the parts that I thought were required to repair it. Fixed the car, didn't fix the car. Called 9 more mechanics. Only one of them showed up, and he was this lovely, weird old man driving like some Nissan shitbox, and he just wouldn't stop talking about all of the sexual endeavors that he had while working as a tour guide in Japan. But he said he fixed the car, so I felt confident for driving it. Took it for a test drive the night before. The day after, drove 150 miles. I get to the first gas station. The car falls apart. The wheel is loose and it's at its side. I go to a mechanic's shop and they literally give me their phone number saying, hey man, I am so confused as to what's wrong. You tried everything that I would have tried. So if you ever figure it out, give me a call.
That's insane.
And I was like, so you can't help? No? So basically 3 or 4 professionals tried to fix this thing. The real issue was I needed the part and the part was not available, right?
Yep.
So then, as Daniel mentioned in the last episode, with the accompaniment of my good friend Ash, if you're listening, thank you so much. He drove all the way from Colorado to where I was in whatever fucking town I was in Kansas. And we drove through that liminal space hell of an interstate ride for 3 days until I finally made it home. That was my week.
Oh my gosh.
And then
man.
somehow I still managed to read almost half of the biography book and get my episode done, and we're good on that front. So, you know what? And things have been good now. Teaching classes, I got a couple of orders. We just sent some stuff out. Somebody ordered a Max Miller knife, like the same one that I made for Tasting History.
Nice.
So things have been good. I'm still waiting to sell this thing. But yeah, that's been the week that I've had. What an incredible journey. I really truly feel like I have been cursed for real by some witch or crone of ancient Greece. Gosh. It was truly an odyssey. Maybe I could fix it. I am no longer invested in that thing. We are
Jolly
selling
Green
it, and
Giant.
I'm going to get. Yeah, it's going to be the death of the giant. And I'm going to get something hopefully with better gas mileage. I might get like one of those little Ford Transit Connects, something that's small, better gas mileage, a little bit more inconspicuous when I'm driving around. Whatever it is, the priority is something sensible.
I could see you, if you could find the right one, I could totally see you in like one of those small sized 80s Toyota trucks,
I love those, man.
I knew you would.
The pre-2000 or the pre-like 2010-ish trucks that are like actually like sensibly sized are the best. I love them so much.
Yeah, I could see you rocking one of those things with like a crazy stripe on the side or something that's like neon yellow and stuff like that. Like
it has to be something. It can't be something too regular. Like that's not my style. So we'll see.
I could totally see you rocking one of those guys. Well, hey everybody, welcome to the Biographers. I'm Daniel Newman. With me is Akiva Miola.
Hello.
And we're back after a 3-week little break. I was, as if anybody listened to the past few episodes, I was in Iceland. My wife and I did a little 10-day trip over there, and it was amazing. And for anybody that's ever been curious about Iceland, all I can tell you is that any picture that you see, any video that you see is incomparable to actually seeing it in person, like most things, but I can tell you it is absolutely overwhelming. One of the waterfalls that we went to, we talked to one of our guides about it later on, and he said, oh yeah, that one's like nature punching you in the face. And I was like, yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, in that it just was so like, oh my gosh, what am I looking at right now? It was really amazing. So anyway, we are digressing a lot. I apologize, everybody. We're just excited.
But a lot has happened to us, man.
I know.
I went through a van odyssey, and you went through your own saga in the hills of Iceland.
In Iceland. They have a very interesting accent that I don't want to stereotype too much because they're sweet people. But
but you're like, I really want to do an impression right now, but I like them, so I'm not going to. I am doing an impression in my head, just so you know.
And I was doing an impression every time that Kat and I were in our rental car driving around somewhere. I'd be like, oh yes, here in Iceland, we want to show you something very nice. Anyways, we'll move on, but we're about to get started onto a brand new series. I am very, very excited about it. And Akiva, I won't steal your thunder, so without further ado, my friend, take it away. And actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we do that...
Oh, yes, of course.
It's been a few minutes since we've done this, so I'm like forgetting my order of events and how I like to say things. But for anybody enjoying the show, again, apologize, we were out for a couple of weeks there. But if you'd like to support us, you can do so on our Patreon page, patreon.com/thebiographers. And you can also, if anybody's extra enjoying the show, you can send us or give us a nice little review somewhere, either on something like Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or whatever tickles your fancy. So there we go. Now, without further ado, take it away, Akiva.
All right. So when I was a kid, I had always had an affinity for the thin-mustached, sword-wielding heroes. From Princess Bride to The Mask of Zorro, I had always been drawn to the tall boots, quick wit, and even quicker blades of Don Diego de la Vega or the dread pirate Roberts. The confident swagger, the incredible tactics, the sharp style, and the sort of good villain energy kind of fascinated me. The most prime example, and perhaps the grandfather of all these tropes, has to have been the story of D'Artagnan in The Three Musketeers. A backwater kid from the outskirts of France naively enters the bustling political world of Paris to join an elite fighting force, only to realize it's not what it all cracked up to be. Thinking about this, I was drawn to write a story about the author of this novel, a Frenchman named Alexandre Dumas. After some research into the author's life, I uncovered a story so bold and incredible, both Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler would try to blot it out of the history books, which they almost did successfully. Now, after mention of it in the movie Django Unchained, it's common knowledge that Alexandre Dumas, despite his fervently French style and disposition, was 1/4 black. But it wasn't simply Dumas' heritage that caused the Emperor of France to try to remove his legacy. It was the inspiration that guided his pen as he wrote his swashbuckling tales of revenge, cunning, and prowess with the blade. As interesting as the author's life was, it turns out his stories were heavily influenced by the tales his mother told him of his father. Born with the same name as the author, his father held the title of General-in-Chief during the French Revolution, traveling as far as Egypt during their military campaigns. Standing a foot higher than his peers, he was feared by men on the battlefield and loved by women of the court. Ooh. There was even a time when his power and recognition would rival that of Bonaparte himself before his life took a tragic turn. Perhaps the most profound thing of all, however, was the fact that he achieved all of his military glory and legend in high society, having been born as nothing more than an enslaved man on the island of Haiti. This is the story of the true Count of Monte Cristo, General Thomas Alexandre Dumas.
Ooh, I got goosebumps, man.
Right?
Oh.
It really is such like the most quintessential rags to riches story in the most outlandish scenario that you can imagine. Like it really does read like one of his son's books. It's so interesting.
No, that was killer intro, man. I'm stoked.
Thank you. Okay, so as always, we'll start off with a preface on the sources for this series as well as the subject matter we're covering. My primary source is a book called The Black Count by Tom Rice. Unlike other figures we've touched on, there are actually very few sources I was able to use to cover his tale, other than the memoirs that his son wrote, which are suspect considering Dumas Sr. passed away while his son was just a boy. In Rice's Pulitzer Prize-winning account, he managed to hunt down any scrap of paper he could to piece together a story that has been degraded by both folk legends and systemic erasure. Very little is left of Alex's own personal account, so Rice does his best to paint a picture of what the general might have been thinking and feeling throughout his life, along with giving context to the social world around him. And as a preface, by the very nature of Alex's life, we're going to be touching on one of the most brutal scenes in history, the transatlantic slave trade. So big trigger warning here. There will be gruesome accounts and social mores that most would find absolutely despicable, including torture and sexual assault. While I do my best to tell the story with a contemporary audience in mind, outdated terminology will be used to give important context to the incredibly cruel and unusual social rules of France and its colonies at the time. At the end of the day, I'm not a black man and can never really know how that experience is firsthand, so I'm using all of my academic and personal experience available to me to toe the line between giving a realistic depiction and being respectful of a desperately hard time for people of African descent. In regards to the French side of the story, I'm no revolutionary expert, nor am I a native French speaker. Throughout the series, you're going to hear me try to pronounce some words properly in French and anglicize others at my discretion. So shoot me. Anyway, I was like, I feel very sensitive about people of African descent. Also, French people, shut up while I'm talking.
It reminds me of when I was in Iceland. I'll keep this very quick.
Yeah.
They told us this whole story of this thing called the Cod Wars, which I had never heard of. And it made me go like...
That sounds hilarious.
It's actually... It's not. It's way more like political and vicious than you think it would be kind of a thing. Save that story for another day. But essentially, I was like, man, it'd be maybe really interesting to find somebody who's a central figure of the Cod Wars and then try to tell this story. But I paused because I was like, the amount of Icelandic words I will have to try to pronounce and absolutely slaughter.
No way. There's no way, dude.
I don't know if I could do it because I'm telling you, I have never tried to pronounce a more difficult set of words than in Icelandic. I'm struggling to say thank you correctly. It's that
What's
difficult. Takk fyrir.
Yeah, see, no, there's no way.
It's
no way.
And if
we try to go to other cultures, but like,
yeah,
you have to. Like, luckily, I speak a little bit of Spanish, so French kind of is like the potpourri versions of Spanish. I can kind of figure that out, but like, I could never do Icelandic or Russian or something. Well, maybe Russian. No, probably not. Yeah,
no,
there's limits here. Like, I don't think I'm going to be learning Xhosa anytime soon. You know, and learning how to do all the proper and necessary like tongue clicks or, you know, whatever. There's just no way.
Yeah,
but
totally.
French, I'm going to try to take a run at, and French people / Canadians, you're just going to have to live with me giving this a shot. All right.
And Haitians,
of course. So anyway, after reading Rice's fantastic book, it's best to start off Alexandre's story with the history of the French side of the family, seeing that there is really no record of the other half. Alexandre's father was a man named Antoine David de la Pailleterie, and he was born in 1714 to the Pailleterie family as the oldest of his two brothers, Charles and Louis. While they were certainly living larger than the peasants they ruled over, the family was rich in assets, but pretty cash poor, which made them sort of the worst kind of nobles. Cutthroat, conniving, and shameless, the Pailleteries had a long history of screwing over one another for titles, land, and really any chance they could get to be in the limelights of Versailles. Since Alexandre's father was born at the turn of the century, he was kind of in a unique position. Antoine would be born at the dawn of the Enlightenment era, when free thinkers would question the status quo with new ideas in the fields of science, art, philosophy, and most especially civil rights. On the other hand, monarchies were more powerful than ever. This meant for Antoine that he was the last generation of idiots before people began thinking critically. So, in the hopes of moving up in society, Antoine and his brother enlisted in the Royal Artillery during the Norman Succession Wars. Most of his life as a soldier was uneventful, with very little desperate struggle or glorious victories. In fact, his most notable moment was likely when, as cannonballs flew through the sky, he held a torch to illuminate a field of honor, laying witness to a rapier duel to the death.
Ooh.
While Antoine, only 16 at the time, watched through torchlight, Prince de Lixin would be stabbed to death by none other than the Red Cardinal himself, the Duc de Richelieu. This story would be the reason why the very same figure, played by Tim Curry in 1993, would serve as the villain in The Three Musketeers.
Oh.
So basically, the son, Alexandre Dumas, like you guys probably are wondering why we keep on using this character over and over in books. It's because of this story that that I heard from my grandfather. He was basically holding a torch while the Red Duke or the Red Cardinal stabbed one of the princes to death.
It also reminds me of the final duel in the Count of Monte Cristo, where they're like in a field and they're swashbuckling and moving around, all that kind of stuff. It's not at night or anything, at least not to my knowledge, but still sweet.
Yeah, in fact, during this duel, one of the bystanders who's holding the torch for the duel actually gets shot all the way through with a cannonball.
Oh
while
my
it's
gosh!
Happening. So these two are like clashing swords. You know, you've got the cardinal in his cardinal's outfit, which seems kind of not very holy, but he's wielding a sword trying to stab this other dude. And everybody's like, go, you can do it. And then one dude just gets completely slammed with a cannonball from one of the Norman forces.
Oh my gosh.
While it's happening, and it keeps on going. Very, very Dumas-esque, right?
Yeah, and for whatever reason, it only clicked just when you said it a second ago that I'm like, oh, literal cardinal. Like Catholic Church cardinal.
Catholic Church Cardinal Duc de Richelieu. That's the bad guy in the Three Musketeers movie.
Oh, crazy.
which we just watched last night, and I love Tim Curry because he only plays himself, and it's great. He's like, "You're too late, Musketeers." You know?
He is
I'm
great.
already going to take over France. Now, after that sort of battle, opportunity began to dry up for the two brothers until Antoine's younger brother Charles got into a brand new enterprise: sugar. It can't be understated the importance of sugar. Nowadays, it's synonymous with cheap sweets that we try to avoid if we can help it, but back in the day, it was one of the most valuable commodities on the planet, used by aristocrats and even prescribed by doctors for a variety of ailments, including blindness. According to Dr. Frederick Slayer, take some sugar, pearl dust, and gold leaf and have someone blow it into your open blind eye, and you should clear up in no time.
Wow.
That is a real prescription from the time. You just stuff it in a straw and then just have somebody blow it into your blind open eye. And he's like, and you'll be fine. No evidence required.
This is why, I mean, not to get too much into this, because I don't want to offend anybody, but I will say, I remember when I was growing up, I was raised very religious, right? And I remember in Christian church, people talking about the Gospel of John and how they're like, you can trust John because he was a doctor. And I remember always thinking, but he was like a medieval doctor. So like, what does that actually mean? It doesn't mean anything. Like,
they just made up shit all the time. Like, I'm just wondering, was there any clinical trials that this guy went through? I'm like, maybe the pearl dust was like an abrasive, and if you had a cataract, like it like sanded it off. But that can't be the best way to, like, there's no way that this helps in any way. Yeah. If anything, it's making you severely way more blind.
Just gives you an eye infection on your blind eyes.
Literally. Like, oh, before I couldn't see, but now they also hurt. But seriously, though, these crystal granules of sugar derived from the cane could make an enterprising nobleman rich in the same way that, like, farmers in Texas did when they first struck oil. And if there was any place for a Frenchman to hit it big with sugar, it was the island of Saint-Domingue. Now called Haiti, Saint-Domingue was split into two, with the Spanish owning the eastern two-thirds and the French taking control of the more fertile western front. Despite being only half of an island smaller than Cuba, Saint-Domingue accounted for over 2/3 of France's overseas revenue. It was a money pit for anyone trying to make a name for themselves, and Europeans were willing to extract as much sugar as possible by any means necessary. Dang. The means necessary, as we all know, was slavery, and the worst kind, too. As far as I know, the worst place and time a black person could ever exist might possibly be in the fields of Saint-Domingue during the early 1700s. Considered even worse than chattel slavery in the South by many historians, the French were entirely unregulated in their behavior to their captives, with the average life expectancy of a healthy slave being only 7 to 9 years after enslavement.
Whoa.
That was like the expected time. They're like, wow, you got 9 years out of him? That's pretty good.
Jeez.
Like, torture of all manner was not only allowed, but entirely commonplace. If a person fell out of line or, God forbid, tried to eat the used up remains of the sugarcane after processing, they were subject to whippings, burning, starvation, psychological, and familial punishment, along with a variety of torture implements designed specifically for slaves. Like, I remember seeing some firsthand accounts, and during the summer, they would make, it'd be like 100 degrees outside, right? And they'd make these people wear iron muzzles over their face because they were so afraid of them taking a bite of the sugarcane that they were harvesting.
I've heard of that. It's intense. Yeah. And when you say familial punishments, I'm assuming you mean they would take out the punishments on the slave's family in some way?
Yes. Yeah. Like you could get punished for getting married. You could get punished for not getting married. You could get punished like if you did something bad, maybe they'll just take your kids and beat them to death or whatever. Jeez. Like there was no regulation whatsoever, right? And we'll talk about it later. There were some laws in place, but those laws were about as useful as you know, air-powered toilet paper. Like there didn't absolutely nothing for these people. So unlike Roman slavery or sort of the indentured servitude of the medieval ages, the plantations of Saint-Domingue operated much more like a concentration camp, using and expending human life as kind of a replaceable commodity. If you have the stomach for this, I'd recommend hearing the harrowing account told by Dan Carlin. But for now, I'll spare you from the worst details I've come across. Which, like I should say, with Dan Carlin, he does a podcast on the Haitian Revolution, which kind of covers. That. Yeah. And I mean, I had chills the entire time I was listening. It was just brutal. But with no moral complaints to think of, Charles Pailleterie set up shop, making one of the most profitable plantations on the island. The two brothers were revolting nobles in different ways. Little Charles was industrious, driving his slaves with any means imaginable to run his plantation and sugar refineries with maximum efficiency, even if that meant pouring molten sugar into the wounds of his workers. In only a few years, he was able to dwarf their old European holdings back in Normandy, and he was able to loan, not give, money back to his old parents so they could die off in style. As for Antoine, Alex's future father, he was more of a classic nobleman, with really no interest in doing work at all. According to whatever old documents we found, it seems the sole reason he sailed to Saint-Domingue was, in fact, to mooch off of his slave driver brother indefinitely, despite telling Charles that it was only going to be a 2-week trip. So Charles gets married, and it's already kind of a faux pas for noblemen to do any kind of work. So like owning slaves is like the fanciest way that you can make money as a nobleman, because most noblemen were expected to just already have money, right? They'd be like, oh, you own a thing and you do commerce? That's ridiculous. How are you? Why are you getting your money that way? So, he's already doing that. And then his brother shows up, says, hey, I'm going to be here for a little while. Just figured I'd come and visit my dear old little brother, and then ends up staying there for like a decade.
Oh, wow.
So while there, Antoine didn't just avail himself of his brother's room and money. In his early 20s, he was known for rounding up some of the enslaved women and using them as mistresses, obviously without their freedom of choice.
Of course.
Yeah. This deeply grotesque behavior was all too common during the time, and Charles took issue with it. Not because it was rape, of course, but because the slaves had belonged to him, not Antoine. So, after a decade, Charles was sick of his older brother's mooching, and according to the legal records, the two came to blows. Charles had likely subjected his brother to some kind of slave torture afterwards. So he was like, I'm sick of you mooching. They got into a fist fight, and then he might have been hung on a rack, or all these, let your imagination go wild. Something happened to Antoine. And this was basically the straw that broke the camel's back. Jeez. In the middle of the night, he rounded up 3 different slaves named Rodrigue, Cupidon, and Catine, which was his most recent mistress, and he disappeared into the forest of the highlands. Search parties were formed to find him, but family would pronounce him dead. No one would know where Antoine was for decades. He wasn't dead, though. He actually traveled through the forest for weeks, trekking all the way across the 7,000-foot peaks of the western peninsula of Saint-Domingue, settling into the well-secluded town of Jérémie. The highlands were sort of a free-for-all, where men with little means could sustain themselves off of smaller, laid-back coffee operations. The deadly scorpions and tarantulas of the plantations were replaced by lizards and giant rats, which were far less deadly, and some even took as pets. Yeah, which I thought was lovely. Here's my giant pet rat.
Yeah. Dude, I would take that over a friggin' tarantula. My worst nightmare.
Oh, my God. Yeah, catch me dead before I'm ever anywhere near one of those things.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Along the hillsides, relics of the New World mingled with runaways from the old ones. The world Antoine saw before him was a scene not unlike that in Pirates of the Caribbean. Escaped slaves plied their trades as unofficial freemen, and whites took refuge there with reasons that they'd prefer to keep to themselves. This is also the era of the buccaneer, which comes from different origins than you'd expect. Originally deriving from the French word for smoked meat, boucan, the buccaneers of Saint-Domingue used to exclusively trade in contraband meats and provisions, which were packaged away from the king's watchful eye. Yeah, buccaneers is basically like Bacon Man, which is funny.
It gives a whole new context in like old movies. You're like, spare any change for an old buccaneer. It's basically saying, spare any change for an old bacon man. It's kind of great.
Yeah, it's just like a total free-for-all there. Like, the way I imagine it is kind of like in Pirates of the Caribbean when they're going to Tortuga, right? And it's just like people of all sorts of walks of life, and there's like everything, like even the animals were sort of a mix of like old world and new. So like monkeys would share the jungle with cow buffalo hybrids. There were dogs and cats along the alleyways, and there was also a wild camel population that was brought in by North African colonists as well. So like it's just this crazy free-for-all in Jérémie. So
when you initially set that up, you were like, and there were monkeys living in the jungle with these cow, I thought you were going to say monkey hybrids.
Cow monkey hybrids.
It's like,
that would have been amazing.
That sounds cool.
Is it like half and half like a centaur? That should be our new...
I'm imagining a cow with hands, and...
That's terrifying. Like, imagine a cow with hands running after you, and when it opens its mouth, it sounds like a monkey, like, screaming.
Yeah, and it can run up a tree, right? So it could, like, grab on the branches, a cow, and then it's got, like, the curly tail like a monkey. That's what I'm imagining.
That is terrifying.
Yeah, and kind of awesome. I'm
that is
amazed
nightmare
that
fuel.
There's no, like,
if we have
Greek...
any artists in our listeners, I would love to see a depiction of that. Thank you.
A monkey cow? No, I'm amazed that, like, of all the things that the Greek mythology dreamt up, you know, minotaurs and centaurs and griffins and all that kind of stuff, there was no, like, monkey cow hybrid in there, you know? That sounds like that would be a lot of fun. I think they were like
maybe brainstorming that, and someone's like, no, that's too no, we're not going to tell our kids that. That's too terrifying.
No,
I would much rather a minotaur go after me than a monkey cow hybrid. That sounds...
We could do, what's the one with the scorpion tail? I can never remember what that one's called. It was in that movie Onward. But anyways, yeah, we can have this lion with a scorpion tail. That's not terrifying. But a cow monkey over the line.
And they eat meat for sure. Like, there's no way that they still eat bananas and grass.
Now we're getting into a terrifying category. Like a monkey cow with blood dripping from its mouth. That's pretty scary. Anyway.
So left field.
You know, hey, we're having fun.
Whatever. We're talking about some kind of heavy stuff. So if we're going to, whatever. We'll talk about monkey
lighten
cows
up a little
bit. So Antoine would use the city of Jérémie as a means to reinvent himself, separating himself from the Pailleterie family and going by the name Antoine de Ile, or Antoine of the Island. He left behind most of the slaves he took from his brother, instead spending what was considered an exorbitant price for his next mistress, Marie Cécette Dumas. Using her to produce children, on March 25th, 1762, Marie would give birth to the future hero of the French Revolution, originally named Thomas Alexandre de la Pailleterie, along with 3 other healthy boys whose names have been lost to history.
Oh, wow.
Now, you may think that being born to Antoine and Jérémie was probably the worst case scenario for little Alex, but in comparison to the life his mother lived, he was actually in a pretty envious position. See, the French government tried to enforce laws surrounding slavery just recently through a legislation called the Code Noir, or the Black Code. Its express purpose was to bestow rights and regulations for white folks to keep racial superiority, which, bonus, it was illegal for Jews to own slaves. So, you know, that's kind of good.
Well,
that's kind of good.
Hey, good job, Akiva. You were a victim in this situation, too.
I just imagine like my ancestors being like, this is horrible, but for some reason I feel like it's all going to work out.
Oh, come on. More oppression for us Jews over here. We can't own slaves. What is the world coming to?
For some reason, I just, I think it's going to be all right. Now,
oh my gosh.
So like I said, it's basically to just make sure that there was sort of a system for slavery because things were kind of getting out of line according to the French government. But as a side effect that the French never really predicted, the Code Noir created a legal loophole for mixed race children, which began the rapid growth of an entirely different caste of society, the mulattoes. The term is pretty outdated, being an old Spanish term for mule, so I'm going to use it sparingly, but basically, an entire generation of mixed folks now had access to the same privileges and opportunities as their white counterparts. Mixed men worked in the government or owned their own shipping companies, while mixed women had remarkable vertical social movement, including their own salons, boutiques, opera houses, and, yes, plantations. With this newfound freedom came a desire to distinguish themselves as far as possible from their African origins, which led some mulatto folks to own slaves, imagining themselves as a culture altogether separate from white and black people. This would eventually lead to a deep contempt that Haitian slaves had with the mulatto class, but for mixed folks, they were simply happy to have their own freedom, even if it was due to a legal loophole that could collapse at any moment. complicated history there, folks. Like,
a little bit.
That's a rough one to talk about. And if you know anything about the Haitian Revolution, you'll know that there were some very, very misguided people on the different sides of history. And it's like, I originally was thinking about writing some sort of condemnation towards these people, but I was like, the system wasn't necessarily built for them. They just happened to be like a legal loophole that they were able to skate out of. And yes, they did, participate in it, which is horrible. But, would the transatlantic slave trade be there because of them? No. So kind of complicated, right?
Fun fact for you is when I was a kid, I didn't have any information on any of this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And so I thought that the term mulatto was actually Milano, and it was that we were calling them like the Milano Pepperidge Farm cookie because it's a combination
so much sweeter
of white and black. And I was like, well, that's actually kind of nice. And it was like, I thought it was like, that was when it started, was with the cookie. And then it was kind of like, people started to be like, hey, look, well, that's how we're going to describe people of mixed race. We're going to call them Milanos. Because
Milanos, that's so
it's
sweet.
Like the Pepperidge Farm cookie.
No, they were called like the mules.
Oh God!
I thought mulatto
that's not as fun.
like something like milk derived, like latte, or I don't know, whatever. But yeah, that now it is kind of debated. There's also a Middle Eastern word to describe like people who are from the Middle East but aren't Muslim. That kind of sounds similar, but I think the general consensus is mulatto is Spanish, right?
Meaning mule, which is a combination of the donkey and horse, right? So
yes, yeah.
That's awful too. So yeah, okay, all around bad. Cool.
Yes, generally bad. But it's interesting because I feel like I've heard contemporary people refer to themselves as mulatto, but I'm just going to avoid the phrase for the most part.
Probably
I'll use
wise.
it when it like makes sense because that's how these people identified themselves, and this was like a separate, like I want to make it clear that this was a separate social class from just black people, right? Like if you were mixed, you were automatically, not automatically, but there was a ticket to get into a different social strata of Saint-Domingue.
And it is an interesting thing when it comes to language like that, where we've learned with like the term Indian. There are many tribes that embrace the term and say, no, we are Indians. That's what we are. Mm-hmm. And then others that say, no, we're Native Americans. And then it's the same thing with, have you heard the term Redbone?
I've only heard it from that one song.
So where the band gets the name is
I've heard that it means that like you have like a red undertone to your skin.
No, it's a combination for people. It was invented in the south of the United States by the people who were a mix of black and Native American.
Gotcha.
So, and they were the ones that coined the term for themselves, to my knowledge. I could be wrong about that, but I thought that was the case. And so red bone, basically, if we're looking at the old racist term of saying the red man, right, which is obviously no longer an appropriate thing to say, but that's the idea, is that you're Indian on the inside, right?
I see.
And so red bone, your bones are red kind of a thing. But to my knowledge, that is actually still a term that a lot of people will use and embrace.
And identify with.
Yeah. So anyway, it's just an interesting thing where language can be...
It's kind of like Latinos. Like some people will be like, don't call me mestizo, but other people will be like, I am mestizo, because mestizo is like we were talking about in Pancho Villa, a mixture of Spaniard and Native American. It's language is really interesting this way, just like the way that it can adapt from being something offensive to being something not offensive to being something completely unrelated. Like right before we recorded, we were talking about the British dish spotted dick, and the reason why it's called spotted dick is because dick was an old word for dough, but now dick is dick, and that's hilarious. But like before, like the two were not related in any way.
Yep.
But despite the remarkable freedom some mixed folks had, it's important to remember who really had the power here. The Code Noir was easily one of the least enforced laws in the world at the time, and if a white person wished to, they could ignore it altogether. It was still entirely common for white owners to have children with an enslaved woman and enslave the children as well, sometimes picking the whitest of the bunch to keep as a, quote, true heir.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I mean, we know this from our own American history with folks like Thomas Jefferson.
Yep.
But whether you call it good luck or bad luck, this was the case for Alexander. While his brothers and mother were still forced into servitude, Alex was kept inside to hear the delusions of grandeur by his washed-up father. While Antoine was no gentleman, he could still remember fragments of his formal education as a boy and would teach Alex about the classic tales of the Iliad or show him the basics of fencing as a nobleman.
Cool.
Yeah. He was like, I'm really great. This is one of those parts of his family history, the brief period of time where, like, I don't want to say he's cool with his dad, but like the two are interacting in like a father-son relationship that I'm like, there is no way that I could imagine what is going on in his head.
Right.
Like what sort of like dissonance or like the mental barriers are you putting up in order to like make this reality make sense in your mind? Like, I don't understand it. But basically, he was the one son, and then the rest of the family were just servants, right?
Oh, wow. That's insane.
Super weird, right? Now, nonetheless, there really couldn't have been a better city, at least in Saint-Domingue, for Alex to grow up in than Jérémie. The city was only a decade older than him when he was born, but it became a boomtown of sorts, serving as the mulatto capital of the world in due time. When Alex was just a kid, Jérémie was nothing but a dirty water, brothel-filled, drunken pirate brawl, but as he became older, coffee became more precious of a commodity than sugar, so mixed folks were able to reap the benefits.
It's kind of like Boston.
Yeah.
That's me digging at Boston, by the way.
I don't understand the history, so I just said yes.
Oh, I'm just saying it's like
I'm curious.
A terrible dirty water place that had a boom, and now it's slightly more accepting of people of color.
Hey, actually, that facts. Okay.
Shout out to our boy Jamie, who is from Boston. So
I know he'll appreciate that. Oh yeah, true. Now, like I said, it was kind of a shithole at first, but once coffee really started to take off and the stocks for sugar were going down, mixed folks were, owning a lot of the plantations and owning a lot of the farms, so they were able to reap the benefits, and they began opening salons, theaters, boutiques, all across a newly paved road. Now, similar to post-segregation America, black people were under scrutiny by conservatives, but certain token exceptions actually became the pinnacle of fashion and culture for more progressive white folks. It was here that the world's first black superstars began to emerge in the opera scene, with people lining the block every single day to see the duo of Minette at least, both of which were mixed women. Also, fashion wars between white women and dames de couleur, or women of color, would have people changing outfits literally 3 times a day just to show off against one another. And generally, the dames de couleur were the ones who ended up getting picked. Like, they would have these like judges and be like, who's the most fashionable lady in town? And they would go and like have like runway fights, which a lot of these women of color would win. Now, later on, there'd be legislation that prevented these women from owning a bunch of clothes. But just in that like sweet spot that Alexander was, a teenager in, it was kind of like the peak of mulatto culture in Jérémie.
And I would say initially I was like, gosh, things have changed so much. But then I think about it, I'm like, if we remove this idea of like, you are of this race, I'm of that race, I feel like, dude, the fashion degree anyways, that exact same thing is kind of going on TikTok these days, where it's like, I need to release 3 videos a day and me wearing different outfits to show how cool I look or whatever. It's like, that doesn't change much.
Yeah. And I mean, like, even with the sort of the race factor in there too, like, you can think about like, I don't know, the 70s, where it's like most people, a lot, or at least a lot of people, especially in the South or whatnot, might not have gone to see, certain black performers perform, but like the Jackson 5 was blowing up on the radio. Yeah. Or like
Stevie Wonder, little Stevie Wonder.
Mm-hmm. Like nowadays, maybe black people aren't the dominant social class, but like Kendrick Lamar is big right now. It's sort of a similar thing in this in a much more like myopic sense for the town of Jérémie, but like that was kind of the same culture that was going on.
I mean, I think it's very little debate we could have about it, right? Where it's like, at least in America, with very few exceptions, black people, you have set the tone for cool in America for probably about 80 or 90 years, if not longer at this point. Yeah. Like, us white people are just trying to keep up half the time and being like, oh, that is really cool. I want to do hip hop. Oh, can we do hip hop now? Like, and now all these white people are doing hip hop. And like
trying to break dance.
I know.
Just like,
anyway, sorry.
Yeah. Kind of the same thing is happening here. Right. But As for Alexander himself, he kind of seemed to enjoy the refinement of Jérémie as much as the sandy frontiers of the mountains equally. Little Alex would stare up in awe at the black policemen, riding astride horses with swords and uniforms when he was in town, and would imagine himself to be a buccaneer on the sandy shores when he was free from his chores. Unfortunately, there isn't much first-hand knowledge of his childhood, except an anecdote told by his son when he was playing out near a river. He was about maybe 13 at the time, and he was tossing some rocks at a log floating in the river, and Alex was shocked to see that one of the logs that he threw a rock at turned out to be an alligator.
Oh, man.
And it leaped out of the water to snap at him, and he screamed for dear life. And some older black dude was taking his lunch, sitting over by the end of the shore, and he saw all of this go down. He shouted for Alex to run in a zigzag motion, which saved him from being eaten. Only Alex was so terrified that he was being chased by an alligator that he zigzagged like a mile all the way home just in case.
Serpentine!
Which I thought was a very sweet childhood sort of memory that sounds like something like my dad would have told me about growing up in Cuba.
Yeah. It sounds like one of those things where it's you have to be, it's not just in a poor community, but it's just it's a very Southern thing, because my mom grew up in Louisiana, and Savannah, Georgia and stuff. And her uncle, this guy named Steve, who's lovely and super sweet, he told me when I was younger that he would catch baby alligators and he would put them on a string and walk them around. And I'm like, what is this world that you people live in these tropics where alligators are part of your funny childhood stories,
The South is just in a completely different universe. Never.
Oh my gosh.
Pet rats, lizards, wild camels, Alex running serpentine away from an alligator, which that's good information in case I'm ever attacked by an alligator. Maybe there's a chance I'll survive by running zigzag.
Serpentine
patterns. I don't know if
that's
actually true, but that's at least what his son said. So... most of Alex's childhood seemed to be filled with kind of stories of island life, along with the basic gentleman's training that his father afforded him. But things were going to change forever when Antoine of the island would emerge back from the shadows of his hidden life. See, back at the plantation, Charles would die of gout after a long battle during his last years. And like a pig sniffing for truffles, Antoine caught wind of this. He had heard that Charles had actually managed to make their poor family name rich again, and popular in the old country as well. It had been decades since any of the Pailleterie family hadn't heard from him at all, so why not make a visit now that he was the only heir left? Antoine would make his quote-unquote family go to the docks, and seeing that he was short on money to buy a ticket back home to France, he would sell his wife of 10 years and his 3 sons. But since he was a nice guy, he decided only to pawn his last son, Alexander, in case he wanted to buy him back.
Oh my God. He sold his family literally.
Literally sold his family. And then he was like, Alexander, you're a good kid. All right. So you're going to be a slave, but I put in the contract that if I wanted to buy you back, I could.
Wow. Jesus.
Right?
Okay. That is brutal.
Just when Alexander's starting to kind of get the beat of things are going well in the town. He's like, wow, we actually got some money. We got some independence. No, we could still sell you if we wanted to. Maybe there is technically a loophole that says that you're free, but I don't give a shit about that, so I'm going to sell you whatever.
So just to confirm and line things up, Charles is the father of Thomas Alexander, right?
No, Antoine is. Charles is the little brother who owns the plantation. Antoine was a lazy dude who skipped town to go start a new life and, basically went incognito from his family. His family considered him to be dead because they never heard from him again.
Oh, okay, that was Antoine of the Isle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Antoine of the Isle.
And then his firstborn is Charles?
No. Okay.
Sorry. Line it up for me. I just want to make sure I got it all
correct. We're going to line it up
correct.
one more time. So the Pailleterie kids are Charles, which is the younger one, and Antoine, which is the older. The two of them were hanging out, and then Antoine, I guess, took advantage of too many of Charles's slave women, and he
fled to the hills.
Town.
Yep.
Then he bought a lady who ended up being the mother of Alexander. Okay. So he had a kid with a different slave when he finally made it to Jérémie. Right?
Okay.
The two of them lived there for like 13 years with Alexander basically being treated to some extent as his real son, where all of his other kids were slaves.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
So he had a whole, gaggle of kids, and he was like, no, too dark. You are my son.
Jeez.
The rest of you maintain the plantation.
Okay.
Right.
So then Charles catches wind that Antoine is out in the jungle.
Antoine catches wind that Charles dies. Right. His younger rich brother dies. And Antoine's like, yep. The younger rich brother dies. Antoine is like, oh,
now I get the fortune, basically, because I'm the next in line.
There's nobody to stop me from taking all of this money now, and I'm the last kid left, so might as well make a reappearance. But I don't really have any money, so what am I going to do? Oh, I'll just sell my family of the last 15 years.
Jesus, dude.
So basically, Antoine told Alexander, pack your bags. I'm taking you to the docks. He sold his wife. He sold Alexander's 3 other brothers, and he sold Alexander as well, but with a clause that he could buy him back if he wanted to.
Dang, dude.
Yeah.
Is it weird that I now have like the opening sort of song from Hamilton in my head? How does an orphan bastards?
A little bit, yeah.
That's kind of in my head right now.
The way I'll talk about this a little bit, but the way I think of Antoine was kind of like just he fancied himself as somebody more refined, but in reality he was just like this smarmy, dirty, lazy guy, like kind of like Captain Barbossa a little bit in like the first Pirates of the Caribbean, when you really don't get to know his character very much. He's just like sort of this like, he talks eloquently, and he kind of puts himself up on this pedestal, but really he is just like a dirty thief.
Pretty
right?
rotten, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, he sells his wife, sells 3 kids, and then pawns Alexander to one of the sea captains. And Alexander lived in unknown and likely brutal conditions for at least 6 months working under this sea captain, while Antoine voyaged back to Normandy, where he would pluck all of the titles and holdings away from his niece and nephew, which they thought that they had it good, right? The two were dumbstruck to see Uncle Antoine return from the dead, since they worked methodically to keep the family name solvent, but there was nothing they could do. He was the true heir. Overnight, the once scoundrel of Jérémie had become the Marquis of the French court, which I, like I said, kind of imagine is like when Captain Barbossa becomes a royal privateer, and he's like still like this dirty pirate, but he's wearing a fancy wig. Either way, with cash in hand, Antoine bought Alexander back, never looking back at the rest of his children.
Wow.
There's so many biographies where I'm like, oh, I can kind of imagine myself being in those shoes. Nope, not this one. Like, what is that? But my dad sold me, but he's going to buy me back. But I was a slave, but he's going to make me rich. But what about my mother and children or my mother and brothers? Like just this, like back, I can't even imagine what he was thinking, right?
No, it's awful, but there is something that is very sort of classical adventure story about it, if you know what I mean. There's this sort of like awful childhood that's almost like, hardening this person to turn into a warrior sort of a thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's kind of what I see here, right? So,
yeah.
He left Saint-Domingue as a slave, and he arrived on the shores of France August 30th, 1776. And this is kind of where we see the most dramatic social shift that a person could really ever experience. In Saint-Domingue, Alexander moved in a social class that was a knife edge away from a group who were literally thought of as less than human. Hell, he was actually sold into slavery just a few months ago, but now his father was a marquis, which technically transferred his status from slave to Thomas Alexander, the Count of Pailleterie, Count of Monte Cristo.
Very cool. And also 1776, start of the American Revolution. Crazy that's happening at the exact same time.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk about that in a little bit.
Cool.
Now, the fantastic nature of it would blend perfectly into his future son's writing, and the first months in France probably were a blur for him, since records indicate him being kind of confused about the identity he was supposed to hold. Like, a lot of the ledgers would have him writing different last names. Like, one time he wrote the last name of like one of his neighbors. He wrote his father's last name. He wrote his mother's last name. He just like didn't know necessarily where he was supposed to be. I think part of this is also a result of how he had to come to France, which was under the guise of the captain's servant. Because, once you get to France, you're technically a free man. There's no slaves in the country of France.
Really?
Yeah. The colonies go for it, but there's no technical slaves in the country of France, right?
I don't know why that feels so French. Do you know what I mean?
The way I like to equate it, and we talk about it a little bit, is sort of the thing with like sweatshop work now, where it's like nobody wants to know that they're buying from a sweatshop, right? But there are lots of countries that benefit greatly from sweatshop labor, and they would be more than happy for those sweatshop workers to come to their country and get paid a regular salary, right? So in the same way, like when he came to France, he had to say that he was a servant, but the second he touched French soil, he's a free man, basically.
So I misspoke. It sounds so American.
Yeah, right? Isn't that crazy?
It is. Good comparison,
now,
too.
What did France think of a man like Alexander being put into one of the highest social positions in the country overnight? Well, it's complicated. Due to his father's status, there was no denying his legal claim as an heir to the estate and as a count. But socially, however, his blackness could either be a curse or a boon depending on who he was hanging out with. Conservatives who benefited from the status quo saw him as an outrage, while progressives and enlightened scholars saw him as kind of an exciting oddity. But it would be a few years before Alex concerned himself in what other people thought, because for now, he had some serious catching up to do. Life in Saint-Domingue had made him desperately behind the curve in comparison to the other nobility that his father now soon expected him to associate with. By 14, a young man must be knowledgeable in the classics, philosophy, math, horse riding, fashion, singing, gallantry, and most especially for the French, fencing. Antoine found himself in kind of a spendy mood, so he enrolled his son in the best academy in all of France, run by a master swordman named Texier-Laboisière. Boisière would not only teach him the way of the sword, but the skills of a man of the Ancien regime. While Alex seemed to do well in all of his classes, he excelled in anything physical. From horseback riding to pugilism, he was incredible, but he truly excelled as a fencer. Once again, I'm just still like, it feels like as I'm writing this, I was like, oh, you're skipping a part. Like, there's no transition period? No. He literally goes from like working as a ship slave to being expected to hold court with other French noblemen.
So wait, let's double back on this really quickly, because I think we brushed over it quickly enough for me to not fully comprehend it. So Alex is now a count. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, he went because his father, remember, the brother died. So Antoine is the last heir of the Pailleterie family. Okay. Antoine is a marquis, which makes your son a count.
Oh, okay. It's just sort of like a succession title kind of a thing.
Yeah. Because we're still Ancien regime right now, which is like the, monarchy, right?
Gotcha.
So the French Revolution isn't going to kick up until Alex is in his 20s and 30s. Okay. And the family had an estate in Normandy. There was nobody to take the title except for, his niece and nephew, but he snatched that up from them real quick. And when he brought Alex back to France, Alex is now free, and Alex is now a count because his father is a marquis.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right. So now, instead of being sort of expected to be in this sort of limbo of like free man, slave, son of somebody who might have been important, I don't really know, because he changed his identity. Like there's not even really any records of whether or not Alexander knew what his father was before he moved to Jeremy. Because remember, he was a fugitive. Like he had stolen slaves from his brother. He had completely abandoned his family, pronounced him dead. That's why he didn't get the title of Marquis.
I will say, though, the impression that I get off of Antoine is that he is the kind of guy who would sit around
Definitely
late at night and go, in my homeland, I'm actually one of the most important people there is, maybe second only to the king or so. Like really puffing himself up, right? To where, I bet you Alex was growing up going, oh, my dad is something sort of big.
Something special.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, hey, Mom, how's all of the chores for the entire house going? Yeah. Yeah, I'm guessing that's probably more the case. He was probably to some extent prepared, but I mean, still, like
not prepared, but I think he probably, like, when he got there and his dad, like, he met up with him, I bet you he was like, oh no shit, you weren't lying to me about all of this. Like,
Yeah,
I bet he had heard stories, at least. That's what the impression that I get.
Yes, that's kind of what I'm guessing is what happened. So now he went from being kind of like ahead of things, you know, he was in a upward moving social class to being desperately behind because he's 15 and only has learned the things that his dad's taught him. But he didn't go to like any royal academy or anything like that. So his dad enrolled him with Texier Laboisière, who's that you know, master swordsman, and he's also a teacher. So he taught him, you know, all the basic skills of being a nobleman, like reading the classics and math and geometry and horse riding and all of that stuff, right?
Cool.
So Alex seemed to do, like I said, really well in all of his classes. He was fantastic at anything physical, especially fencing. And it would be at the same academy that the teenage Alex would meet a legend of the fencing world, someone considered to be the greatest sword fighter in all of Europe, someone who, behind the powder on his face, shared the same skin as he did.
Oh, wow.
Chevalier de Saint-Georges.
Chevalier.
Kind of interesting.
Cool.
Worthy of a biography as well. Honestly, if I didn't do Alexandre Dumas' father, I could have done Chevalier. But he was originally named Joseph Boulon, and he lived a similar life as young Alex, though he was already 35 when the two ended up meeting. Saint-Georges grew up in Guadeloupe with a white fugitive father and a freed black mother, and even attended Lavoisier's school when he first came to France. He gained the title of knight directly from the king himself, who made him an honorary member of the King's Guard after an impressive duel over a racial insult Chevalier had received.
Sweet.
Saint-Georges' race had painted a target on his back since his first duel, with white aristocrats lining up to challenge him with the blade, which he never lost. There's one account of him technically losing with an Italian dude, but the circumstances were apparently very odd, and like the laws, it was like a technicality loss.
Oh, okay.
Because the Italian wanted to lose wanted to win on a technicality, but
okay.
Undefeated, right? Like for all intents and purposes, he is the best of the best. He's the Michael Phelps of fencing, and a black man, to boot.
Cool.
Having fought. Yeah, it was really cool, right? Like, having fought all of the people who wished to challenge him when he was about 35, Chevalier would retire from his sword fighting days to become a composer and violinist of the highest order, being a favorite of none other than Marie Antoinette.
Wow.
Now, yeah, right? You can actually listen to I was listening to Chevalier's compositions while I was writing this. They're on Spotify. So, this incredible swordsman, the mentor of my biography, also was a composer.
That's wild.
In order to keep his sword hand nimble, however, he was known to pop into his old school for some sparring. He must have been quite surprised to see Alex staring back at him when they first arrived. If a 16-year-old fencer meeting one of the King's Guard and idolizing him doesn't ring a bell, you probably haven't read The Musketeers. The two would spar for hours together, with some of Alex's white classmates writing jealously in their journals that their black classmate was getting special treatment. While Chevalier was deft as a hummingbird, striking with elegance and grace with the shorter épée, practice with young Alex showed that he was going down a different path. Alexander was already a teen when he came to the academy, and 15 years of work as a semi-slave gave him an imposing physicality that lent him to use his whole body in aggressive, strong moves. The small sword was too fragile for an athlete like him. He was destined for the saber, the preferred sword of a military man.
Cool.
Now, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's like cool and also sad, right? Where you're like, well, because you had to like live this brutal life of a slave, that sucks. But then it also gave you this physicality that lent you to be a saber fighter instead. See what I'm saying? There's this conflict in my brain that's going, I want to say it's cool, but it's also sad at the same time.
You know what? Throughout like this whole first episode, that feeling is gonna just keep popping up. Where you're like, he's a badass. I'm like, oh, but he's a badass because the world is bad to him.
Yeah, because of terrible circumstances.
That's kind of the whole scenario here. But it is very like Dumas. Like, it's very like fantasy swashbuckling tale, right?
Yeah,
like,
totally.
I even think of like Brandon Sanderson's Way of Kings. You know, Kaladin, the main character, is starts off as a slave when he first picks up on the story, and because of that, like, just intense resistance to discomfort, he is just leagues ahead of the other people around him. And kind of the same story for Alex right now.
It also really, I'm already getting this funny picture of the Count of Monte Cristo, where essentially, if you boil it down, right, it's a story of this good man who is served a platter of the absolute worst injustice.
Yeah.
For no reason at all. And through that injustice ends up learning all these things and learns how to be one of the best sword fighters in the world, and then is able to achieve all of these things with his knowledge and his hard work and all this kind of, they're the echoes, you can feel it. It's cool.
Yeah. Now, outside of school, he would be amazed by the transformation that his father had taken since they arrived in France. While Alex had certainly been accustomed to minor luxuries in Saint-Domingue, there was no indicator that his father was anything more than a disgraced slave-owning farmer. Here in France, however, he seemed to magically transform into the most powdered dandy he had ever seen. His dad was wearing brocade vests and silk stockings, and he also had like a number of diamonds that was so profound that Antoine's jeweler regarded him as the greatest customer he ever had in his life. Wow. Right? This guy was spending money fast. And perhaps as some recompense for the 15 years of, Alex's beginning of his life, Antoine showered him in any luxury that he could afford, from his clothes to a carriage to even got gold buckles on his shoes when he finally, arrived in France. His evenings were spent at parlors and shows where he kind of noticed the odd position that he had in French society. It's here that, despite the fervent attempts to stamp out men of color, we see a bit of a dichotomy. While some would refuse to even associate with mulattoes, claiming that they would disfigure French society, others deeply admired Black aesthetics. For instance, in a profile piece on Alex at the time, the author writes, quote, "He is one of the most handsome men you could ever meet, whose interesting physiognomy is accompanied by a gentle and gracious manner. His frizzy hair recalls the curls of the Greeks and Romans." See, the negative connotations of Black beauty, kind of stemming from Southern phrenology and all of that shit, had not really become popular in France yet. Unlike Americans who would see Alex's trait as inferior, young ladies would admire his deeply dark skin and angular features, seeing him kind of like a reminder of the timeless beauty of the ancient, Romans or Greeks.
Interesting.
Yeah. So to put it simply, Alexander did great with the ladies. And now that he was killing it. He was also like a foot taller than all the other French dudes, which was probably like, he was probably like, if it was the modern times, his height would be the first thing on his bio,
Yeah. Tall guys, you got it. You don't understand. Maybe you do understand, but you have a strategic advantage. Automatically, you can be a not great looking guy. Like Shane Gillis, I'm sorry, he's not a hottie, true. But he's super tall, and I think automatically people are like, oh he's kind of hot. Like,
yeah, it is an unfair advantage, which, considering Alex's life, he should get as many unfair advantages as he can.
That's absolutely fair.
Yeah, he was killing it though, like really. And he was also considered American. And now that the American Revolution was going on, Thomas wasn't just considered novel, but also kind of an ally of sorts. The story of the American Revolution was deeply romanticized in France, whose military came to our aid in a big way. Men would wear, quote-unquote, insurgent-style coats, and women would pay honor to our electric ambassador, Benjamin Franklin, by decorating their dresses with copper wires. See, while Americans imagined the revolution as a battle that spanned across the East Coast, France forced Britain to fight it as a world war, pressing their outposts in India, Jamaica, and even Africa. In fact, most of the British Navy wasn't even present for the American War since it was busy quelling fires across the globe. Whether Alexander was from the British colonies didn't really matter to the French. He would always be considered an American in their eyes, which made the ladies like him all the more.
Go figure.
Yeah. Now, after a few years, Alexander's training as a gentleman was complete. He managed to cram an entire childhood's worth of study into just about 6 years and was fluent in all the manly arts a nobleman should be. Now, at 22, he was a bit of a late bloomer, but that made him all the more anxious to leave his father's estate and to live in the center of the universe, Paris. So that year, Antoine agreed to fund his move to the big city, buying an apartment right behind the Louvre, just as D'Artagnan did in the books.
Wow.
Yeah, kind of cool. Like the same part of the same neighborhood and everything. Cool. And just like the young protagonist, Alexander would see that the City of Lights wasn't all it cracked up to be. Paris was kind of a city of opposites. While it was considered the height of sophistication, it was also one of the dirtiest places on the planet.
Still is.
Hey, true. Shout out to America.
Yeah, we're so much better.
No, so for a young noble with nice clothes, there was really only one way to get around, since the city was so incredibly disgusting, no one could set foot in it. Quote, "A carriage is the grand object for anyone in the scramble for wealth. Paris is necessarily filthy, black with grit and metal fragments detached by the eternal traffic, but it's the domestic waste running into it which chiefly accounts for the smell. No foreign nose can abide. It is sulphurous with a tang of nitric acid. A spot of this mud left on a coat will certainly eat away the cloth." Oh, acid mud, y'all. That's how dirty Paris was.
What did they call it? They called it, what was it? Civilian filth? What was it?
They called it the domestic waste.
Domestic waste. Is the most polite way I've ever heard anybody say shit
piss
before.
And shit all over the roads, and it is disgusting and will eat through your clothes like moths. Yeah. So like if you were kind of rich, but you want to be like regarded in high society, all of your clothes are black. Like there's no way that you could wear any colors. If you wanted to wear a color, you had to have some sort of way to drive you around town, like a carriage.
Jeez. That's crazy.
Now, yeah, it was disgusting. Like the fact that he was like, no foreign nose can abide. He's basically like, if you're not from here, you're not gonna like it here.
I mean, I know I'm mostly joking when it comes to Paris being dirty. I've never been, so I can't technically attest to it. But I will say that, you know, it reminds me of this past Summer Olympics that we had, where they had to spend like a year trying to figure out how to clean up the Seine because it was so filthy.
Then they tried to do it anyway.
Yeah, and people got sick.
Yeah,
it's like, oh, it's pretty gross.
Well, have you ever heard of the Paris syndrome?
The Paris syndrome?
Yes.
No.
So this is like a real psychological effect that sometimes happens to folks from like Japan and
you told me about this, but explain it.
Yes. So it's a psychological effect that Japanese tourists have when they go to Paris. You know, they're used to very nice, clean, beautiful cities, which they regard as mundane because obviously they're from Japan, and they have this super idealized, you know, imagination of what France is. I know when I was in Japan, I was like, their French food, there's no way that French food is better than Japanese French food. Like, there's no way. So they have this incredible, like, idealized version of what France is going to be like. And when they get there, they get like anxiety, vomiting, panic attacks, because they realize it's just like this very dirty, kind of hostile European city where no one really wants them there. So then they end up like flying all the way over to France, imagining it's going to be like Ratatouille, and then it's just rats.
Yep. It honestly reminds me of Hollywood. Me living back in Los Angeles and the amount of friends I would have from out of town being like, can we go to Hollywood? And I'd be like,
I want to go see the stars. I was like,
yes.
You want to go see...
I would say, I'd be like, brace yourself. It's going to be dirty. It's going to smell like pee. There are going to be more...
Spider-Man
honestly, homeless people, yes, than you've ever seen in your life. All the places you think are going to be great are going to be ridden with people trying to take your money. Like,
yep. I remember there was one dude in Japan when we were in Kyoto who was like talking to us, and he was basically like a reverse weeb, where like he loved King of the Hill and you know, King of Queens and like all of the sitcoms, like Full House, all of that. And he was talking about how much he loved them, and he was like, he was telling Shalana, he's like, I've always wanted to ride a New York subway. And I was like, no, you don't. No, you don't. These are way better. Like, do you want to see a guy breakdancing in his own piss? Okay, come to New York. Like,
I mean, I do get what he's saying, but I hope he tampers his expectations. Where like there is something about being like, dude, come on, getting onto the subway in New York. I'm a New Yorker now. Like you it's cool.
Yeah, I
but
guess it is
go
cool.
And you go, all right, this is just a way to get around. Like that's it. Like you got to keep your expectations at about that level.
Keep your head down. Don't look at anybody in the eye.
Yep.
It's like
take a seat as fast as you can if it's available.
But anyway, you know, Alexander was kind of lucky because he was situated in sort of the best part of town. He lived right next to the old Palais Royal, which used to be the brooding manor of the Cardinal Richelieu. In recent years, though, it was renovated into a tree-lined promenade, with vendors of all kinds selling anything a young man could ask for. Now, despite its name, the Palais Royal was under the ownership of the Duke of Orleans, which is important because it was the perfect environment for free thinkers. The Duke of Orleans prevented the king's police from entering it, and the Enlightenment era was able to flourish there without regulation. So, there was no monarchy enforcement of like what you're supposed to be reading or writing or discussing while you're in sort of the neighborhood that Alexander was living in. And it being one of the only clean places in the city, the French academia were encouraged to debate on the nature of liberty in open-air cafes or buy exotic traded goods from across the world. In fact, many revolutionary parties would begin there, since they could speak freely against the king over a cup of coffee. Now, an interesting little side tidbit that the author of this book that I've been reading mentions is Karl Marx also meets up with communist revolutionaries at the same cafes as the French revolutionaries, whether it was by coincidence or not. Technically, the same neighborhood ended up breeding both, democratic revolution and also communist revolution like 200 years later.
Interesting.
Yeah. Doctors would sell their most recent medicines, philosophers were able to debate, and scientists would begin to unravel the mysteries of electricity there. And as high-minded as all of it sounds, these people were still French after all. The Palais was also a place for the enlightened to get a little dimmer after hours. At night, the cafe goers would head to the taverns and parlors or maybe catch a late-night show with a romantic rendezvous. Ooh. The most popular theater for this was Nicolette's, famous for its outlandish shows and extremely dimly lit theater boxes where anything could happen.
Ooh. I thought you were going to say the Moulin Rouge.
No, it's Nicolette's, and the whole thing was like these people would go talk about how they hate the king, and then when night rolled around, they'd be like, yo, I heard that they don't turn on any of the lights at Nicolette's, so if you want to bring somebody, get your own theater box. Who knows what's going to go on there? No one can see. And according to the records, Alexander was a very popular date to take there, going every week or so with a variety of different companions. His usual romantic evening was cut short, however, in September of 1784, when a naval officer approached the box Alex was sharing with a young lady. His name was Jean-Pierre Titon de Saint-Lamont, who was an ex-captain from Martinique. Jean-Pierre was well known for talking people's ear off about the daring journeys across the Atlantic, when in reality he was really nothing more than a slave catcher. So, when a washed-up slaver meets a black gentleman in France, a fight is certain to ensue. Titon went up to Alexander's date, ignoring his presence completely, saying, quote, "You are beautiful. You have a nice figure and a nice bosom, and I would be pleased to get your address." Shocked, Alex knew that he needed to keep his cool, but Titon continued to catcall his date for several minutes. Seeing that Titon wasn't going to take a hint, Alex eventually said, "Madame is respectful. Leave us alone." Ignoring him, once again, Titon addressed the girl, asking her if she liked Americans. Nervously, Alexander's date nodded, which sent Titon into an angry laughter. Quote, "Pardon, madame, I thought you were here with one of your servants." As Alex stood up to confront him, Titon got right into his face, saying, quote, "My friend, we know what a mulatto is. In your country, we put chains on your feet and hands, and if you dare say a word, I will have you arrested by the guard and taken to prison. You know who I am."
Damn.
He's like kind of living this life, and this guy from basically his past, not his actual past, but sort of, the past of living in the Americas comes up to him out of nowhere. And it's obviously an attempt to goad him into fighting. Yeah. Alex calmly replied, "I contempt every word from your mouth, and I know what you are. Nothing more than a clerk in Versailles."
Classy.
Titon began... Yeah. Classy, right? But Titon didn't seem to take it so well. I think he was... the police report noted that he was drunk, and he began to howl in anger. And Alexander's date ran away, and the friends of Titon tried to force Alexander to the ground, but they were no match for the prodigy of the Black Chevalier. While the police reports suggest a calmer interaction, Dumas, the author, writes that his father broke free of the two men constraining him, grabbed Officer Titon, and hurled him out of the theater box into the orchestra pit below.
Dang.
Fully expecting this to be the beginning of a duel, Alex calmly walked out of the theater to await his combatant outside, but instead, he was greeted by 2 police officers. But, dusting himself off in shame, Titon chose not to press charges. But after the fight, Alexander's life seemed to revolve around the responsibilities of being the heir of his father. But for reasons one could only guess, their relationship continued to deteriorate. It seemed that no amount of money could be thrown at Alex for him to forgive him, even though all he did was enslave him and sell away his only mother and brothers. Only a few years later, Antoine would get married to his housekeeper, and Alexander would not attend the wedding. Thinking him ungrateful, Alexander's father would begin to tighten the purse strings, refusing to pay for anything for his heir. As a result, Alex would come to ask permission from his father to join the military. Now, most noblemen who joined the armed forces would find themselves at an officer's academy and then move on to leadership positions, but Alexander no longer wanted his future handed to him on a silver platter. Truth is, he probably wouldn't be accepted as an officer anyway. No amount of paperwork would make the academy want to have a black man in their ranks, especially if they were filled with people like Officer Titon. Jeez. Instead, Alexander would have to start as an infantryman, which his father refused. Antoine would never allow the Pailleterie family name to be brought so low, so he told Alex that if he wanted to join the military, he would have to forfeit his family name and all that came with it. It was an ultimatum that he thought Alex would never agree to, but he underestimated his son. Thomas Alexandre de Pailleterie abandoned his given name, taking on the maiden name of his enslaved mother that he would never see again. Jeez. It's on his enlistment papers that the name Alexandre Dumas is first written.
Wow.
Yeah. And 13 days later, Antoine, Alexander's father, would pass away. In an odd twist of fate, though, it was kind of pure luck that Alexander denounced his family name and became a private, since if he took on the role of Marquis, he would have found out that all of his lavish life was a lie. Antoine had been living off of debts for years and would pass on the poor fortune to his new wife, who is now more destitute than she had been when she was a housekeeper.
Oh my gosh, what a scumbag.
I know, dude. In fact, there's actually a letter where the housekeeper has to ask the niece and nephew that were originally going to take the estate before they found out that their uncle was still alive. She sends a letter being like, hey, I didn't realize Antoine did not actually have any money, and he bought all of these diamonds and he bought all of this stuff, and it was all on credit, and I now don't even have money for bread. So can you pass me a couple bucks? And they were like, no, dude, no.
Yeah.
Fuck you. We're not going to do that. So in a way, after this whole fight broke out and he was no longer, being given money to be a gentleman of Paris, him joining the military was kind of the best case scenario, because if he ended up being the Marquis, he would have been in debt for the rest of his life. Full stop.
Dang, that is crazy. Dodged a bullet.
Yeah. So as for Alexander, he was headed for a regiment with a daring reputation, being named after the dragon fire that came out of their short muskets. Donning a sharp black coat, Alexander had gone from slave to fencing prodigy to young count, and he was now a private in the Queen's Dragoons.
Cool.
And that is where we'll pick up on the next episode of Alexandre Dumas.
Oh, cool. This is my style, man. This is good stuff.
I know. This is a very Daniel-coded series.
I mean, come on. It's so... It reminds me in many ways of the whole Hero of a Thousand Faces, which Star Wars was based off of,
yes.
Where it's you go through time and there's all these different stories and legends throughout all these different cultures, and they seem to follow these same sort of themes, where it starts out agrarian, right? Out in nature somewhere, same idea, right? And then there's hardship, something happens to where you then have to leave the farm. Oftentimes a wizard comes to town and whisks you away, and you can kind of make that comparison too, where it was hardship happens, then he gets put onto a slave ship, and then, I don't know, there's just all this crazy stuff.
And then he ends up becoming something that's just so incredible. It is really Count of Monte Cristo, man.
It really is.
He goes from being a prisoner to the, one of the highest, ranks that you can be in the French aristocracy.
Yeah. This is sweet. This is, like I said, this is totally my style of oh, cool, what happens next?
Yeah.
Type of a story,
In some ways, this was easier than Tesla because I didn't have to learn engineering to do this.
Oh, yeah.
But in other ways, it was harder because the record here is just so poor.
Yeah.
Like, it, for one episode, we're probably at least 100 pages in to the book. Right.
Dang.
Just so that I can kind of piece apart this story to make something of it. Because, for the most part, Tom Rice, who writes The Black Count, which is like my main source, has to flesh out Alexander's story with lots of different parts and pieces of French history and like talk about the culture and talk about this because he doesn't have journals or records or even really official records, obviously, because, his father was a fugitive when he was born. So it kind of felt like I was stitching together like 4 or 5 different stories because it just seems so outlandish that this character, this person goes from, if he stayed in Saint-Domingue, there'd probably be no record of him. No one would ever really have known that he existed. Right. To going to France and being a fucking count, hanging out with Chevalier, which we still have his music and you can listen to on your favorite streaming service, to, being one of the greatest fencers in his academy, to getting into fist fights and brawls with, ex-slave drivers up in these, theater boxes. It's so, I don't know, like a real fantasy story. It doesn't even sound like a thing that could happen to somebody, but it did.
Totally.
It's just so interesting.
That was kind of how I felt with Pancho Villa, too, where the amount of stuff that happened that was like, this feels like a stereotype of old Western movies.
Yeah, like the train exploding and the jumping onto the,
all of it. Somebody's sinking in quicksand, him taking the matete and smacking the guy over the head and then escaping on a horse and riding until the horse can't run anymore. And then he gets, it's just so cool. It's the same type of stuff, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, dude.
Well, right on, man. Stellar first episode. I loved it. I know our listeners will too. So great job. Keep it up. I'm looking forward to seeing where this whole story goes because until you brought this guy to my attention, I didn't even know he existed. And I have a feeling most people don't, Yeah. And again, I love... We've had even listeners say that to us before of saying like, please don't just stick to big names. Like, please do.
Yeah, we got recently
going
a
back.
message about that.
Yeah, go back to smaller names to like, make sure that we're understanding or learning about people that we didn't even know about, right? So I love that kind of crap. I was surprised, honestly shocked to find the amount of people that had no idea and still don't know who Pancho Villa was. In history. They're like, who? And I'm like, man, you know who Pancho Villa was? Okay, well, check out his story because it's fascinating.
Well, we grew up in LA, so it's a little different.
That is true. I feel like there is a little bit more Mexican history that bleeds through, especially into Southern California. But anyway, we'll wrap it up here. I think we've taken up enough time, but everybody, appreciate you for listening. Thanks for taking the time. Hope you found this interesting. I can't imagine that you didn't because it was pretty friggin' awesome to me. But if once again, if you do want to support our show here, you can do so by going to our Patreon page, patreon.com/thebiographers. We only got like 2 tiers right now, so $5 or $10 if you want to throw it our way, feel free. We'd appreciate you. If anybody feels like leaving us a review somewhere on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else you get your podcasts, we'd appreciate that too. It always gives us a nice little boost. If you have any questions, comments, or corrections, you can send us an email at thebiographerspodcast@gmail.com. My wife told me I need to enunciate that more because sometimes I can go, thebiographerspodcast@gmail.com. And people don't understand that, so that was great feedback. So yeah, again, if you have any questions, comments, corrections, thebiographerspodcast@gmail.com. Nice and enunciated for everybody out there. And what else? You can find us on social media. That's going to be at TikTok. It's going to be on Instagram. It's going to be on YouTube. And we're going to try our hardest to get back into TikTok videos. It's just we're limited on time with all of the work we do and our regular jobs. Yeah. And then last but not least, for anybody interested in any type of metalworking or knife making needs, Akiva, take it away. What you got?
I have a new code for you guys. As you've heard with my van problems, I am trying to pool up a little bit of money for the next ride. So if you use the code VAN at checkout, you will get 25% off of your order for any knives. And dude, that is a huge chunk of change. I already had somebody buy one of those knives. I was like, man, is that a little too big of a discount? But we're going to let it happen because I need a car. So if you put in van, check out at metalworkbymiola.com. I've got all sorts of cool stuff on the website. I've got Damascus stuff. I've got monosteel stuff. We got all sorts of different colors. I even got a set of these beautiful black dyed, stabilized curly maple handled knives, which are looking really excellent. And then as well, if you are interested in taking a class with me and meeting me in person here in Denver at Hardy and Fuller, I teach classes anything from your first knife ever to making a chef knife to we're doing a folding knife class here in about 2 weeks.
Sweet.
And just give us a check out, Hardy and Fuller or Metalwork by Miola, code VAN for 25% off.
Beautiful. Check it out, everybody. Again, thanks for listening, and do remember, like always, ignorance is not stupidity, is the absence of knowledge, and I do hope you all learned something today.
See ya!
You've been listening to The Biographers. For more information, please visit thebiographerspodcast.com.